Good afternoon, and welcome to another edition of Second Take, where we go behind the stories at The Real Deal. Joining me today are Sylvia Varnhelm-Reagan and E.B. Solomon. Welcome to you both. Let's get started with a story that I think is essential for every residential broker in New York City, whether or not they can show apartments during this pandemic. So we've been hearing very different things, and Sylvia, you've had an interesting, I want to say, 36 hours. Tell us a little bit about what happened and what happened next.
Yeah, well, hi everyone. So on Wednesday night, the New York State Association of Realtors sent out an email to its members saying that the state had designated certain residential services essential. And essential means they can operate with more freedom than most other businesses, which of course are under restrictions because of Governor Cuomo's stay-home order, which applies across the state. So basically, the services that were deemed essential under this new guidance were commercial and residential showings, appraisal work, and some back office duties. So the news of this was quite big because, of course, it meant that brokers might be able to show homes again, which had been prohibited and which was an area of controversy in the industry before it was prohibited because E.B. and our colleague Erin Hudson and I had covered this debate, which was whether showings should go ahead or whether they were posing too much risk to brokers and to buyers and sellers. So I wrote a story about this new development, and I contacted the state's economic development arm, which is responsible for determining what businesses are essential and non-essential during the pandemic, and they confirmed this classification change had happened. Once the story came out, brokers were very concerned about what this would mean for them. Could they claim unemployment now that they were essential and could technically work? Would they have to go and show homes? Would their buyers expect that, or sellers? Would their bosses expect it? So there was a whole raft of confusion and questions. And I can continue on with what happened next, but I might throw to E.B. quickly to talk about some of that initial reaction because she had spoken to a lot of brokers and brokerage chiefs at that time to get their thoughts and feelings and impressions on the news.
Absolutely. But before we get there, I just want to, so they were, hey, you can go back to work was sort of the understanding that you got initially, right? You could show, but that doesn't mean they're compelled to show anything, right? They should be looking at, they're independent contractors, they're not employees being compelled. So I guess, E.B., my question is, why do they feel that pressure? It is still, we're very much in the thick of everything at the moment, you know? So why did they feel that pressure to get out there again?
Well, I think that for the past few weeks, there's been a real divide in the industry, and the division has been over whether it's prudent or safe or advisable to go do in-person showings. So starting like 3 weeks ago, before the governor had his pause in effect, agents were really, really divided. Compass's Leonard Steinberg said it was a moral obligation to stay home. Other brokerage chiefs, Bess Friedman, for example, said, that's really not a moral obligation. You can't put that onus on someone. So brokers were divided. They didn't know whether it was better to stay home and help flatten the curve or go out, do showings, be as safe as possible and take precautions. When the guidance seemed to change this week, agents were suddenly in this terrible conflict with themselves potentially. Many of them had deals that were maybe in progress. So they had walkthroughs that maybe they had to do. They had showings, for example. If you're a listing agent and you have a unit, do you then have to go show it? Weren't you hired and didn't you sign an agreement to market it? At the same time, I think brokers were really, really scared. They didn't want to go into other people's houses. And they didn't want to come into contact with other people. But there's this balance between, keeping yourself safe, keeping society safe, and then also earning a living and, keeping the economy going. Because I think that for a lot of agents, the top agents, the most successful agents, they can take a few weeks off of work. If you're a rental agent hustling every day, it's a very different question.
Right. And it's also that culture that I think New York City brokers pride themselves on, which is, getting deals done no matter what. If there's a flood, I'll jump over the water and I'll go show my apartment. That is creating a very fundamental problem now, because now it's not something you can brush off. They're used to being tough in this case, but now they can't. But anyway, Sylvia, so what happened next? We do the story, which we break, I think, late Wednesday night. And then there's this giant uproar from several different corners of the industry. And then Thursday was a very different day.
Yeah, so on Thursday, the Real Estate Board of New York came out with an email to its members, basically cautioning them to not jump to any conclusions, certainly not go back to work and do in-person showings immediately. They said, look, these guidelines are not final, and really just emphasize that this situation was in flux. And it was their view that, it was the board's view that the executive order remained and things were as they were the day before. So the sort of splintering of messages between the New York State Association of Realtors and REBNY was, I think, caused further confusion because you've got these two bodies saying different things.
Where did the allegiances lie in New York City? Are people more likely to look at REBNY or look at that state association?
Certainly REBNY is my impression. I think that the New York State Association of Realtors, or NYSAR, represents people across the state and perhaps has more of an allegiance upstate than it does downstate. I mean, I don't want to present myself as an authority on that because it's still something I'm peeling back the layers on, but that's my initial impression. And if anyone's watching this and has other thoughts, please email me.
Well, I can just jump in quickly just to clarify. I mean, NYSAR is part of the National Association of Realtors, so that's the national group for real estate agents. They're called realtors. New York City is totally an anomaly. They're not realtors in New York City. There's no MLS. And so I think a lot of New York City brokers are really proud of the fact, like, you're different than everyone else. They're not part of the organization.
I haven't heard any agent any sort of significant agent ever describe themselves as a realtor. I've never heard that term in New York.
No, because in New York, they're not. And, you know, in the immediate aftermath of the NYSAR news alert, you know, agents in New York City were like, we don't get in our car and drive to houses with lock boxes. We ride up an elevator with 6 people. So it's, they are different. It's different.
Right. So what happened next, Sylvia? Then, so was there, it sounds like the message changed quite dramatically since the first story.
Right. So it went from this sense of anxiety and panic to this sense of complete confusion. Okay, what is going on? What do we have to do? What's our status? Are we essential or not? And so I started hitting the phones, basically. I wanted to speak to the Empire State Development Agency, the state agency that determines this essential and non-essential distinction. I wanted to talk to NYSAR, REBNY, and just keep kind of unraveling this, because I wasn't clear at that point what message was correct, although I felt confident that the ESD had made this classification change because they had confirmed it to me. So the original story was kind of verified by this state agency who had confirmed, yes, we've changed this classification. But what does that mean? Okay, that was the next day's question. And so ultimately, after doing some reporting and putting in calls and speaking to these various people, I learned that the state agency was seeking to clarify their directive or their guidance on this issue. And they told me, yes, these four real estate services, I should say, have been classified essential. But on the topic of showings, they said, we want to emphasize that it's virtual showings only. So that means that brokers can go to a vacant apartment and shoot a video, or they can conduct a virtual showing in their office if they need to, but they can't do an in-person showing. Okay, so they can't, it's not, the fear that people had about what this meant and them having to do in-person showings again, that was, that question was answered by the state, and they said, look, it's virtual only, which was obviously a critical point, and right. we wrote a follow-up story leading with that, because we felt it was important that now we'd had this clarification, that we communicated it as fast as possible, because we know how important this is and how many brokers were watching these developments.
The sense of relief then that probably followed the second story, or the sense of, okay, you know, we don't have to jeopardize our health, I wonder, Ibi, if this lasts for 2 more weeks, then I'm sure that sentiment will prevail. But let's say this is the case for 2 more months, do you think that brokers will still feel the way they're feeling right now about not wanting to get out there?
That's a really tough question. The real answer is I don't know. None of us knows. None of us knows how long this goes on. Right now, agents are really scared. They're skittish. They know they're anticipating the lost income, but they're anticipating the lost income across the board, along with so many Americans and so many people across the world. I think that in 2 months, some of the agents are probably just going to be chomping at the bit, ready to get out, like we already are, many of us. Others might be in real financial strain. So it's really hard to tell. I mean, I would hope that in 2 months we're at least past the peak, and some things can change. One thing I think that's interesting about this guidance is it does seem to strike a nuanced sort of tone. It is a balance between don't do any showings, stop all real estate services, and here are like the handful of ways that you can keep your deals going. And I think that's why it was important for all of the real estate industry stakeholders who had been discussing this behind the scenes. I think it was important for them to get a few small pieces of the business moving again so that it's not all shut down and not all at a standstill for 2 months. So theoretically, you can keep doing deals. If you have deals in the pipeline, they're not totally, dead. I don't know, though.
And I guess one of the most fascinating things from your story was just how the state is dealing with this, right? They're getting this barrage of requests to exempt them from being non-essential. They're having to go through each thing bit by bit. My sense is that they weren't fully acquainted with how the real estate industry works. And that seems to come across in your story, Sylvia. What do you think?
Yeah, well, I think that it's a really important piece of this whole equation. How does the process of determining whether an industry or a part of an industry is essential work? And what I learned from reporting this story is that this state agency is fielding a number of inquiries every day from businesses or individuals or industries, basically saying we would like to be deemed essential. And they're considering these applications on a rolling basis. They submit these applications to their attorneys who consider them, and then they notify the individual or the business or the industry representatives of their decision in real time. So it's not a matter of we have released this press release or we have done something official to determine this or announce it and therefore it's gone into effect. No, it's much more ad hoc than that. So they notify the person or the business, and then periodically they'll update their website with statements and more official guidances on these decisions. But because they're responding to this fast-moving pandemic and they're trying to be as responsive to businesses as possible who might need an answer really urgently, they're having to do this in kind of a free-flowing way, which I think in this case had caused confusion too, because REBNY, for example, had said, well, there's no official directive about this on its website, so it can't be official. But what I learned is that it is official because they've said it is, but in saying that, it could change again tomorrow. So it's not concrete. They are going to issue a more clear guidance online that will be publicly available. So that's something that we'll, obviously write about when it comes out, and I'm sure readers will be interested, but that's not available now. The genesis of this, according to NYSAR, was actually that a lot of real estate professionals had contacted the state agency independently and said, we want to do an appraisal, for example. I'm just making that up as an example, but we want to do something that will allow this transaction to go forward. Can you deem this essential? Yeah. And this agency had gotten back to them and said, yes, that's essential, okay? And so again, quite ad hoc. And so they had contacted this organization and said, we're hearing we're essential, we're hearing we're essential. And so that was apparently what triggered this organization, NYSAR, to do its own digging and to release this email blast, because they had heard from their members that that's what the state was telling them, and they wanted to communicate that more broadly. Obviously, it caused confusion, and there's still questions around it, questions that I don't even know the answer to. But I think it is interesting for people to understand a bit more about how this process is working at the state level, and just the fact that it's so fluid and that it could change again and again and again because
I think this is bringing out how fascinating this agents are independent contractors, but this is an industry issue, right? And this doesn't happen very often. So I'm glad we have you both reporting on the ins and outs of it. This has been an edition of Second Take with Sylvia Varnhelm O'Regan and E.B. Solomon. Thank you very much. Tune in again. Bye.